This lecture is going to be about drugs and addiction, and really how it affects the nervous system. Well, first, some statistics about drugs in the United States today. Now, there are more deaths and disabilities each year in the U.S. from substance abuse than from any other cause. It's going to be a big part of being an applied psychologist, you'll find out. About 18 million Americans have alcohol problems. I'm getting a lot of these statistics from the NIH website. The CDC website has good statistics about drugs in America. About 23.5 million over the age of 12 needed treatment for illicit drug or alcohol use in 2011. That's a tremendous amount of people. In other words, if you are a practicing psychologist or therapist or psychiatrist, you're going to be dealing with issues of addiction, or either with the client themselves or with people that they know. There's been a trend lately about really prescription drug abuse, especially the opioids, like OxyContin, for example. Look at the increase since 1999 of the number of deaths due to overdose of opioids. These are prescription drugs. These are ones taken for pain, for analgesia or pain reduction, and they are really being abused, and there's a black market for them, and of course we're getting a great deal of increase in death. These are just some statistics about different types of drugs. Here in red, just all illicit drugs. This is marijuana. Now, marijuana kind of had a drop back in the 90s. There was a lot of campaign against marijuana use, but it has started to go up steadily. I think a little bit to do with what we understand about marijuana and marijuana's effects, and also the legalization of it in some states. And here are some of the other ones. The use of cocaine has actually been going down for many years, and same with heroin use, although that's not shown in this chart. Now, this is just some statistics I thought were interesting. You know, the reason that people go to the emergency room very often is due to the use of drug, cocaine, marijuana, heroin. These are some statistics I found at the NIH website. Hydrocodone, that's an opioid, an analgesic. These are really large numbers. This is an interesting table because it talks about healthcare costs, and there's a lot in the news about healthcare costs. And if you look at tobacco, alcohol, illicit drugs, these are very large costs. Now, you need to understand these might be healthcare costs. People getting cancer, people getting injured, people having liver disease, and those. But this is the overall cost in terms of the judicial system and lost work and all those other factors that go in with using just these types of drugs. These are billions of dollars. This is tremendous, tremendous impact on our healthcare system and our economy. Another thing to know is we spend an inordinate amount of money on prisons and prisoners in the United States. At about 760 prisoners per 100,000 people in the United States. That's less than 1 in 100, but it's close. We win. The United States has more per capita prisoners than in any other industrialized nation. I mean, when you talk about places like Japan, they're talking about 90 out of 100,000. You know, so we spend a lot of money, tremendous amount of money, on our judicial system, on our prison system, and more than half of the Americans' federal inmates are prisoners on drug convictions. So drugs are a really big part of our society. We've had this war on drugs since 1971, and look at how that really big increase has increased over 800% in 40 years, because there are more penalties, there are longer jail terms, and this has really affected our society, and affected certain aspects of our society, certain members of our society, such as people of color, disproportionately. These are really big, influential factors, and you as psychologists or people interested in psychology have a lot to do with understanding these statistics. One thing I want to say before we really get into the biology of addiction is to point out that we oftentimes think of the bad drugs are the ones that are illegal, like cocaine and methamphetamine and heroin, and those are bad, don't get me wrong. But you know what? Alcohol is a tremendously bad drug. It's highly addictive. The withdrawal symptoms from alcohol are severe, worse than just about any other drug. People die of alcohol-related accidents and car deaths. It's really a bad drug when it is abused. And so I looked up they had an article in the London English CNN, and they did the survey and of healthcare providers, and they came up with the idea that the most harmful drug is alcohol. Beating out crack cocaine, beating out heroin, we need to take that in consideration. And as far as the brain concerns, legal or no legal, a drug is a drug. And some have higher dependency, and some have higher withdrawals, and some really target that motivation center. Alcohol is certainly one of them. Another problem that we oftentimes see with drugs, and this is really an important factor, is the notion of relapse. What we see with people who are highly addicted to drugs, and by the way, many people take drugs, marijuana, cocaine, alcohol, don't show addiction, don't show these overtaking of their lives, but many do. And those that do, the rule of addiction is relapse. People get off drugs, they might be off drugs for a long time, and they oftentimes relapse. These statistics, 81% of people who go through Alcoholics Anonymous are back taking alcohol in 1 month. 90% in 3 months, 95% a year. Alcoholics Anonymous, 95% failure rate in the year. You have to understand that there are many treatments for drug addiction, alcohol addiction, and some of them work better than others, but oftentimes people relapse, and that's something to be really mindful of, to understand that the best thing you can do for somebody who is addicted to drugs is teach them, help them to get back off of those drugs when they relapse. So here are just a few drugs. I'm not going to talk a lot about drugs' effect. There are other aspects to the section where you can learn about drugs' effects. But these are the opioids. We have our own endogenous opioids in our brain, and these mimic them in some ways. And those are pain reducers, but they also get a euphoric high. Cocaine and crack cocaine, these are dopamine agonists. They help dopamine by keeping dopamine from being brought back into the presynaptic cell by blocking the transports. These are some of the other drugs that are oftentimes looked at as illicit drugs, and marijuana. Marijuana and nicotine and alcohol, these are all legal or not legal drugs. Some of them are used in medical circumstances and others are not. The first thing I want to talk about is drug tolerance and a little bit about the physiology and the psychology of drug tolerance. Drug tolerance is simply taking more of the drug in order to get the same effect, upping the dose, the necessity to up the dose of the drug. Now, a very important thing to understand is there's physiological changes that happen with a prolonged drug use, but there's psychological aspects that lead to tolerance as well. These are more associative processes, non-declarative processes. So let's look at the physical tolerance. The body and the brain, they works in homeostasis. It tries to keep a balance. And so what you can do at the neuron level, at the postsynaptic neuron, at the presynaptic neuron, is to change the number of receptors, to increase them or decrease them, change the number of neurotransmitters, increasing or decreasing. So when we talk about a change to the nervous system because of an exposure to drugs, alcohol, tobacco, other drugs, we might talk about an upregulation. And you see this with both illicit drugs and prescription drugs as well. This might be the case of increasing the number of neurotransmitters or increasing the number of receptors. For example, people who take antipsychotic drugs, drugs to reduce the symptoms of schizophrenia, which reduce dopamine activity, a system might up the amount of dopaminergic receptors or dopamine production to accommodate that decline. Downregulation, you see that oftentimes in tolerance, where you reduce the number of neurotransmitter receptors. So let's take a look at the neuron really quick. Remember this, here's the neuron, you have the action potential goes down, it causes calcium channels to open up and release neurotransmitters. And here at the synapse we have vesicles with neurotransmitters in them. Those are released into the synaptic cleft. They affect receptors, but they are also sucked back in through transports. These are presynaptic transports, and we call that a reuptake. Okay? Most of the drugs we're going to talk about are all affecting the synaptic area. So, you might release a lot of neurotransmitters. They are not guided to receptors. They hit receptors. The more neurotransmitters, the more the receptors will be activated. So you might have a case where you increase the number of presynaptic neurotransmitters. The more neurotransmitters, the more likely they're going to fit receptors. That's an upregulation. But we might also have a downregulation where we reduce the number of receptors on the postsynaptic cell. Not as many receptors, not as much activity in the cell from these chemical gated ion channels. We see that a lot in alcohol. We see that in certain types of the opioids. So let's take a morphine as an example. That's an opioid. We have our own opiate system in our brain. We call these endogenous opiates. These help with pain. Sometimes people who run a lot, they get a runner's high because they're producing a lot of their own opioids and another neurotransmitter called the mu enkephalon. Let's say, and I'm just giving this as an example, I'm not using these numbers to represent actual numbers, but just to help to clarify downregulation. Let's say that the normal activity means that 70% of the neurotransmitters find receptors under normal circumstances. If one takes morphine, then let's say all this extra mimic of a neurotransmitter, now the receptors are being activated 95% of the time. Well, that's higher than 70%, and so the system is going to want to balance this out. So the postsynaptic cell begins to remove or downregulate the postsynaptic receptors for opioids in order to get back to that 70%. However, if somebody suddenly stops taking morphines, then they go through a severe withdrawal because now the pain system in their brain, which normally works well, is downregulated. There's not the morphine taken exogenously through a pill or a shot, and this system is downregulated and the person feels pain. That's a withdrawal symptom. So I have here my drawings of morphine. I have here neurotransmitters, our own opioids, and here are the receptors. So there's the system working normally, and all of a sudden it's super activated because of the mimicking of maybe morphine. So this system is working even more. You can get the euphoric effects, you can get the effects that you get from morphine. So the system begins to downregulate. It begins to remove receptors. It's trying to maintain really a synaptic homeostasis. Well, now there's no more drug, and this system doesn't work nearly as well, and somebody feels withdrawals and pain. It will eventually get better. A few days they will upregulate, the system will work better. Doesn't mean you have to go, you're not going to live through some bad withdrawals for a few days, but the system will get back to a normal level. So that was physiological tolerance. Now let's look at what might be termed a psychological tolerance. This is tolerance that might be specific to an event due to Pavlovian learning or classical conditioning. So a major part of tolerance is for psychological reasons, learned reasons, not declarative, not consciously, but at subconscious level. We call this a conditioned compensatory response. A conditioned, Pavlovian condition, compensatory response, to compensate. So classical conditioning causes the body to compensate for the expected drug. So let's take this example. Suppose a heroin addict takes the drug in the same place every day. These stimuli, just like a bell to a Pavlov's dog, these stimuli tell the brain that the drug is coming. They're in the same place, they see the same things, they smell the same things, the needle begins to come out, the pills begin to come out, and the brain says, morphine is coming. I must compensate for this effect. So these environmental cues will act as a conditioned stimulus in a Pavlovian term. The body might release metabolites from places like the liver in anticipation of that morphine coming, and it will begin to break it down. This is not a conscious thing. Nobody's doing this consciously. This is a conditioned response. So what the heroin addict might do is they might take higher doses, because not only are they having a physical tolerance that we talked about, downregulation, but we have an event. We have a stimulus event that tells them, the body, that morphine or heroin is coming, and they have a conditioned tolerance. So they begin to up the dose more and more and more, and the body gets better and better at breaking it down. If, however, they take this new high dose in a different environment where the brain doesn't know the morphine's coming, it's a different house, it's different smell, different looks, right? Then we get overdose often. It's statistically true that heroin addicts tend to overdose in unfamiliar environments because they don't have the conditioned tolerance. Conditioned tolerance, again, is tolerance specific to stimuli that signal the brain that the drug is coming, and the body begins to prepare. So let's go over a few theories of addiction. There are many, and they're very complex, but let's go over a couple of them, a few of them. So one deals with this tolerance idea, this physical dependence. And the idea is that people are motivated to take drugs habitually, even if it damages their life, because they are counteracting bad withdrawals. This is known as the negative reinforcement theory of addiction. The cells downregulate, they need the drug, they need more and more of the drug. If they stop taking the drugs, they start jonesing, they start hurting, they have sweats. So drug users are driven to counteract withdrawals. So one way of dealing with this motivation factor of addiction is gradual withdrawal, slow withdrawal. Maybe they get on methadone or other aspects to ease that withdrawal. But here are some parts of this theory that don't tend to work very well. First, some highly addictive drugs, like cocaine, don't produce the severe withdrawals we see from, let's say, alcohol and morphine, even though this is still really highly addictive. And we also know that patterns of addiction aren't always consistent. I need the drug every single day to counteract withdrawals. They kind of go in cycles of binges and detox and binges and detox. Another very important aspect is the idea that somebody can relapse even though they're not showing withdrawals. They've physically gotten back to a steady state, a homeostatic state. Many drugs produce withdrawal but are not typically self-administered. Tricyclic antidepressants are not addictive forming as such, and yet they produce bad withdrawals. And also self-reporting that craving for some drugs is often highest immediately after the drug taking, when drugs are producing subjective pleasure. Okay, so the idea that withdrawal is the motivating factor for addiction, while that might be influencing addiction patterns, it doesn't seem to be a complete theory. Again, somebody can be off the drug for a year. They're not going through withdrawal anymore, and yet they still have a very high chance of relapse. So we need to modify these theories. Another idea is the positive theory of addiction is that drugs feel good. They give you a euphoric feeling. They are hedonic in their reward. They feel good. People are motivated because they feel good, the positive effect. So some of the problems with the idea that drugs are addictive because of their pleasurable effects is, well, some things like nicotine don't produce the euphoria, highly addictive drug. Opiates can produce dysphoria. This is kind of interesting. The drugs can make them feel sick. You know, you could actually take a mouse and get them so that when they taste a certain food, they get morphine. They can be addicted to morphine, but they won't eat the food because the food is associated with something that makes them feel bad, a conditioned food aversion. You know, just on a practical sense, drugs can be extremely, extremely damaging to people. It can ruin their lives. They can lose their family. They can lose their job. They can steal. They can prostitute themselves, all for this drug. And the drug isn't really producing that great of a euphoric high anymore, subjectively, as they report. And cognitively, they know if they take this drug, all these horrible things happen. And one has to just look at this rationally and say, the badness of their life far outweighs any of the pleasure that can come from the drug. This is just a picture I found of somebody who started taking methamphetamines. Okay, it's a really destructive drug. So I want to get to another theory, a theory that I particularly like. It's a very popular theory now. It's by Robinson and Berridge. They had a couple of papers out, one in 1993, another follow-up later on. It's called the incentive sensitization theory of drug addiction. So, repeated drug taking results in persistent changes in the neural system that mediates craving for a drug. Craving for a drug. It is the incentive salience of the stimuli associated with the drug itself, and not the pleasure that motivates the behavior. In other words, people are motivated to do it. They don't necessarily like to do it. Brain areas that are linked to this are highly sensitive to the drug, and this is important. We'll talk about this area, but also to the stimuli that precede the drug, that are associated with the drug. This will be clearer in a few slides. This sensitization, this highly motivating sensitization, become highly motivated by the taking of the drug and by the stimuli that are associated with the drug, like an alcohol bottle to an alcoholic, are very long-lasting, much longer than the physical withdrawal, physical addiction part. There's still the craving for the drug years later. These stimuli may produce craving. And we're going to talk about craving here in a moment. A small amount of drug, if somebody doesn't take the drug for a long time, but then they take a small amount, they are alcoholics. They don't have alcohol for 6 months. Then they have a taste of wine, some beer. It may prime this area to resensitize, to get really active really fast. So let's look at the area of the brain that we think is involved. The area of the brain, well, it comes by several names. One of them that Robinson talked about, he called it the Mesotelencephalic dopamine system, because cells began in the mesencephalon down in the brainstem and project up into the forebrain, into the telencephalon. Some people call it the Mesolimbic. Starts in the mesencephalon, goes up into the limbic system, and a lot of people consider the frontal lobe to be part of the limbic system. Either term is okay. Now we know that this area plays a high role in what's called intracranial self-stimulation. If I stick an electrode along this pathway in a mouse's brain or a rat's brain, and they were given the opportunity to press a lever to stimulate this area, electrically or chemically. They can press the lever and you could put some dopamine agonists like cocaine along this area, that in many cases the rats will press this lever and they will do nothing else. They will press this lever and press this lever, and some will die doing it. They will forego food, they will forego drinks, they will forego sex by pressing this lever to get this area stimulated. These pathways is dopamine. Dopamine is the main neurotransmitter used here, but many other things affect that dopamine level, as we'll find out. So here's a rat brain, and we can see down here in the mesencephalon, we have two dopaminergic areas. We have the ventral tegmental area, and we have the substantia nigra. The substantia nigra might be sending signals up to the caudate nucleus, but it is also involved, and it is projecting the ventral tegmental area, VTA. It's projecting its neurons up into this forebrain area, an area called the Nucleus Accumbens. And the Nucleus Accumbens is projecting cells up into the frontal cortex, as is the VTA, and back and forth. The frontal cortex plays a large role in planning. So this is the motivation center, this is the planning center. Here's just another picture. There is the substantia nigra up into the striatum, has a lot to do with motor activity, and this is the VTA up into the prefrontal area. This is the mesotelencephalic right here, or mesolimbic. Now, this is an important distinction, because I'll hear this and you'll hear this in some of the videos, that this is your pleasure center. You activate the center and you're feeling euphoric and pleasure. There might be a little bit to that, but that's not really how a lot of scientists see this area. It's not the pleasure center. In fact, there might be other areas of the brain that are using opioids that are the pleasure center. I've actually read it being called the do it again center. In other words, whatever you just did, do that again. Highly motivating into planning of action. This is the motivation center. This is the planning and doing center. And this is very important for getting food, getting water, and finding shelter and sex and all the things we do as mammals to maintain ourselves. But it can be highly influenced by drugs and even behaviors. The nucleus accumbens projects up into the prefrontal area for planning and motivating and executing behavior. Addictive drugs can be quite different in their action on behavior and neurochemistry. Opioids and alcohol and cocaine and methamphetamine and THC and marijuana can act very differently. But ultimately, they are going to be affecting dopamine activity, increased dopamine activity in this mesotelencephalic dopamine system area. All of these drugs have been shown to influence increased dopamine levels. So here's something that I wanted to talk about from Robinson's article, is that craving is an extreme form of wanting. It's not liking, it's not enjoying, it's motivating, it's craving, it's thinking about it. Now this might be thought of as sort of invasive thoughts, right? Things that get into your brain and you can't get out, and you're thinking about it and you're rationalizing it. How can I do this? How can I get this drug? How can I rationalize it in my brain? It's an impulse. Now, we sometimes crave things. Oh, I crave a little chocolate now and then, crave a little caffeine now and then. But sometimes these cravings can overwhelm all other behaviors. Such a powerful, invasive into the brain, can't get it out, motivating system. So what initiates these cravings? And I want you to understand that in this context, cravings don't necessarily mean this kind of, oh, it would be kind of nice to have a little piece of chocolate. No, cravings are a very strong motivating system. Now, what we find with this is that craving is really high just before taking the drug. This really high motivation system reflects an activation of the dopamine system and might be influenced, and probably is influenced, by just the sight of stimuli associated with drug taking. Needles and mirrors and pipes and alcohol and smells. Maybe it's a little bit of the feeling of unpleasant withdrawal is a motivating system that gets that area going. The recall of the positiveness, these are all influential. So if somebody's an alcoholic, they might not have these overwhelming cravings when they're not around alcohol. But when people begin to see these images, they begin to start that craving and that wanting and that thinking about it. So you might have a very strong need for caffeine every day or coffee every day. If you haven't had it and it's 11 o'clock at night and you drive by a Starbucks, you're going to start thinking about it. It's going to start circulating in your head.
This reminds me of a scene from a TV
What
show.
was going on in your room? I didn't hear you.
I said, I like the little things. The way a glass feels in your hand, a good glass, thick with a heavy base. I love the sound an ice cube makes when you drop it from just the right height. Too high and it'll chip when you drop it. Chip the ice and it'll melt too fast in the scotch.
You ever try this, Leo? It's Johnny Walker Blue. Bartenders are selling it for $30 a shot.
Good scotch sits in a charcoal barrel for 12 years. Very good scotch gets smoked for 29 years. Johnny Walker Blue is 60-year-old scotch.
I don't care. What happened in the room?
I'm trying to tell you what happened.
Sure, get to it. You don't want to find out what a $30 sip of scotch tastes like?
No, I gotta stay sharp for tonight.
Why don't you just say I'm an alcoholic?
They're two CEOs. I'm trying to get them to give me $500,000 apiece right now. It's not really the best time to mention it. The president's still at the debate site.
How do you feel about the temperature, sir?
It's good.
It's not too cold.
It won't be later. This is a 550-seat theater, and they'll be seated a half hour before we start. So the temperature will be up 4 to 6 degrees.
The hotel room, Leo.
We already gave to the RNC, but we're worried we may have backed the wrong horse.
You want to hedge your bet?
That's why we're here.
Good. Get me a sip of that. That's what I remember.
You had a drink.
I'm an alcoholic. I don't have one drink. I don't understand people who have one drink. I don't understand people who leave half a glass of wine on the table. I don't understand people who say they've had enough. How can you have enough of feeling like this? How can you not want to feel like this longer? My brain works differently.
So I was reminded of that clip from that TV show. That TV show was from the West Wing. And in that TV show, the character was an alcoholic. And if you noticed in that, what was he talking about? He was talking about the little things, the glass, the ice. If you watched his eyes, he's tracking the drink. This is what's happening. He's not thinking about drinks other times, but when it's in front of him and he sees it, this is activating the mesotelencephalic dopamine system. It's not just the drug that causes the craving. What's even more scary about this area, you don't even need the chemistry. You don't need the dopamine agonist. You don't need the alcohol. All you need is a reward schedule. Slot machines influence the mesotelencephalic dopamine system. Somebody who's addicted to gambling, the nucleus accumbens lights up like a Christmas tree when they see this. If you put them in an MRI and you look at the nucleus accumbens, this is the motivation center. This is the do it again center. Involved in drugs and food and sex and all these natural incentives, but it can be influenced to do really bad behavior. If we take a dopamine antagonist, and this can prevent intracranial self-stimulation, we lesion the nucleus accumbens, and you don't see that addictive behavior. But this is the motivation center. You can't just go and lesion the nucleus accumbens of humans, then you lose all the other motivating factors. This is really important. This theory assumes that it's not pleasure, it's not euphoria, it's not a high, it's motivation. And not motivation in a light sense, motivation in a very strong sense. Craving, invasive craving. So we see that the nucleus accumbens is affected by many things. Creb proteins, we've talked about Creb before. Creb proteins can actually reduce the pleasurable sense of the drug in the nucleus accumbens, so people need more for the same high. This thing called delta FOSB is a protein that hypersensitizes the nucleus accumbens to drugs. It can be very, very long lasting. This is why somebody who hasn't had a drink for a long time, they take a drink and suddenly they're back to that craving, back to that falling off the wagon. They want more, as he said in that clip. We know that cortisol, stress hormone, people who are under a lot of stress, can make the nucleus accumbens hypersensitive to dopamine. This is why we see relapse or cravings even higher. This is why we see cravings and relapse much higher under stress. Well, there's a physiological reason for that. So, a few other things. We know that the cocaine increases synaptic dopamine within the nucleus accumbens. We can record that. Animals will self-inject dopamine agonists directly into the nucleus accumbens, that motivating factor we talked about. Self-stimulation, but in this case, self-administration. And we know that lesioning the nucleus accumbens stops that behavior. But I hope you understand that this behavior can be completely destructive in a laboratory and in real life with people. And a cocaine withdrawal results in reduced nucleus accumbens dopamine activity. There can be some down regulation within the nucleus accumbens. I found these graphs, which I think are interesting. What they're measuring is dopamine, DA, dopamine concentrations, measured in the nucleus accumbens of rats at the time when cocaine is self-injected. And you can see that this dopamine level goes up. This is also true for amphetamines, which are also dopamine agonists. So we know that relationship between these drugs and dopamine activity in the nucleus accumbens. The key to an addictive drug, to make it highly addictive, got to increase dopamine levels activities in the nucleus accumbens in some way, either directly, like amphetamine and cocaine can do, methamphetamine can do, or indirectly, such as alcohol and morphines, which actually inhibit the neurotransmitter that then inhibits dopamine. Inhibit the inhibitor and dopamine goes up. So there's the dopamine concentration, there's the start. This is also true for nicotine, okay? Dopamine activity when somebody is smoking. You got to understand that, one of the keys to addictive drug also is speed. How fast can you get dopamine increase in the nucleus accumbens? How fast can you do it? So methamphetamine and cocaine, these are really fast-acting dopamine agonists. And the cigarettes companies, they work really hard on making cigarette nicotine get to that nucleus accumbens faster by using a lot of different chemicals. Hey, tobacco isn't the tobacco that people were smoking 200 years ago. It is engineered for speed of dopamine activity in the nucleus accumbens. It's really a terrible habit. So while activity in some neural systems decrease with repeated exposure and tolerance, they can get back. It can get back, right? And so somebody might be an alcoholic and they stop taking alcohol and they might go with severe withdrawals, but that might last for a few days. The motivating influence of the hypersensitivity of the mesotelencephalic dopamine system to not only the drug, but the stimuli associated with the drug or stimuli associated with those schedules of reward and gambling, these are long lasting. And these can cross-sensitize too. You can be addicted to one and get this cross hypersensitivity to other drugs. We see this a lot of times with people who are smoking and they take, you stop smoking, you drink more, or you eat more. And this can be influenced by food as well. The dose required to self-administrate methamphetamine decreased in rats. Doesn't take much. For some, and this is when we get genetics involved, for some people, it doesn't take much to get them into that highly motivating system. A single injection of amphetamine or cocaine or morphine induces behavioral sensitization, lasts for weeks or months. Wow, hypersensitivity to the drug can go on for a very long time, even after a single injection. For some people, this can be a really devastating component. But remember, it's not only the drug, but it's the stimuli associated with the drug. The incentive motivational properties can be long-lasting. They might not want it all the time, but when they see it or they're around friends, they want it again. One of the worst things that can happen is somebody has stopped smoking and they have friends around them going, hey, that's great, you're stopped smoking. Well, they're smoking. It's really hard to kick that when you're seeing those motivating properties. So just some closing thoughts. One, you have to understand that not everybody gets addicted to drugs. People can take alcohol recreationally occasionally. People can take even morphines and even cocaine and not show this life-destructing behavior, but some do. A lot of them do. So, more than half of all adults have a family history of alcoholism or problems with drinking. It's very destructive. I mean, this is a legal drug, More than 9 million children live with a parent dependent on alcohol or illicit drugs. Think about this if you're working in schools or you're working in marriage and family counseling or you're working as a psychiatrist or psychologist. These are going to be very influential things. I think one of the first questions you ask somebody who you're as a client is, what drugs are you taking? What drugs are people around you taking? And don't differentiate between one drug and alcohol. Alcohol is a drug.